I think one of the first things that companies need to think about is that these shouldn't be two discrete processes. We recently did a webinar where we asked a polling question of a couple hundred people that were in attendance of the webinar of where did these business processes or functions sit within their organizations. For compensation plan design, it falls into one of three departments. It could be led by HR, it could be led by sales, it could be led by finance. There's also a category that we asked where I think is probably the best practice around sales compensation plan design is that it should be a committee of these three different departments, and one of those departments taking leadership over that design process. And to me, it's whoever best can do that. I recently made the argument for that being HR, as they own pay within organizations. To me, sales compensation is an extension of incentive pay for everybody else. It does require more data. There's a few more steps in the process to calculating sales comp, but I think from a design standpoint, a committee across those three departments, potentially led by HR.
From my perspective, I think it's the admins, the sales operations owns the design portion of it. So they're the ones that interact with the Salesforce daily. They're the ones that truly understands kind of what motivates, the combination of what motivates the Salesforce, but also what can be implemented and realistically measured and administered. And so in order to have an efficient plan, something that achieves maximal revenue, you need that combination and that understanding.
If the organization has enough scale, then what I've seen and what I think works is having some kind of a sales effectiveness team that owns the comp plan design, right? And then of course a dedicated team for doing the comp plan administration. And there's certainly many large enterprise organizations where that type of scenario plays out and works fairly well. I think the challenge is when you get down to smaller, more mid-market type organizations that don't have the resources to have that independent team. And then you have to start looking at, well, where do we get the fractional support to run both the plan design efforts and then the ongoing comp administration. And then I think there can be different scenarios there, but basically, the pretty obvious one on the admin side is to have some participation, on the design side is some participation from the ops team, the sales ops team, because they're going to have the data and be able to drive some of the analytics that you're going to want to use in the plan design process. And then the tricky one is who owns plan design, right? Because sales leadership will have their point of view and their incentives. The executive leadership team will have their point of views, and you really need somebody to kind of manage that process of decision making of how the plans change. And if you have the underlying data team or the data that's needed to kind of drive the decision making provided by the ops team, you're in a pretty good spot. But somebody has to basically take the lead between sales leadership or someone from your exec leadership group who understands the goals and the kind of forward looking where the sales organization is going versus where it is today to set the right kind of framework for the incentive program.
I think the most important thing is the team is close, connected enough to sales to understand the strategy and priorities, as well as understanding the data and that there's some financial accountability. So I mean, for that reason, I think it generally makes sense when sales comp sits with either a revenue or sales operations function, but I've also seen it work well reporting into finance as long as there's that connectivity and partnership with sales. I think it becomes tougher when it reports into a function like human resources, because I don't think it's not as easy to have all of the connectivity points that you need.
I believe sales should own sales compensation from design to administration. You're ultimately using sales comp as a tool to motivate certain behaviors within your sales reps, which is why I think it should sit with sales. That said, I think you need support from others within the organization to design and administer plans. You need HR to help benchmark, make sure you attract and retain top performers. You need HR to support from a pay equity standpoint. You also need tech and sales operations to help administer and manage the programs. You also need finance to inform the cost of sales and how much you can truly spend, and to approve incentives, short-term incentives, contests throughout the course of the year. So I do believe it's a collective effort, but it truly should be owned by sales.
I think there needs to be more appreciation for how the actual incentives truly tie to generated revenue. So I think that there's a misconception out there that if we didn't have a sales rep in territory A, then it would probably achieve the same sales or 95% of the sales as if that rep were there in territory. And I find that people just over the years get a little bit desensitized to the actual impact of the rep being there, working the territory, working the accounts. And so if you don't really think that there is a strong correlation between effort and sales, then you're probably just going to view, oh, this is our incentive plan. We've been running it for 30 years. Yes, just pencil that in for X amount of dollars per year that we're charged.
I think the risk with having the sales ops or sales comp team is too much focus on the administrative side of things and making trade-offs on things that can be more easily administered, more similar to what's in place today, that may be the right decision for the business, and then figuring out how we're going to administer the plan. Now, I'm not saying that you ignore that side, because the execution side is very important, and you can't execute on a great plan. It's not that great. So they need to have a strong voice at the table. But I think ultimately those who are looking forward and where the organization is going and where the most opportunity is are going to set the course through the incentive program, set the course for the sales organization, need to be the ones ultimately calling the shots. So that would indicate to me that the top of the sales organization really needs to be kind of guiding that process.
The downside of sales comp design sitting outside of sales is you end up designing a program that isn't truly motivating because certain parts of the organization do not understand the culture and the sales process and what's required to move a particular deal forward or manage accounts. I think that's why it's best served to sit within sales with the support of others. From a administrative standpoint as well, is I think you add a little bit of a trust factor and transparency when it sits within sales, when it sits within sales operations in particular, because you have people who are closer to the sellers, understand how these deals are being made, understand any exceptions that happen. So I think you lose a little bit of the trust in some cases and the transparency when it sits elsewhere, as opposed to it sitting in sales.
I think it's very easy to have a purely administrative lens on the sales compensation function, in that they are kind of there and responsible for just making sure that everyone is kind of paid accurately and on time. So I think, that viewpoint can kind of be cast onto sales compensation as a function, when at the end of the day, the core purpose of sales comp is to drive motivation for the sales organization and drive revenue impact.
Why I kind of bias towards the more separated functions is that the ultimate objective of the admin team is to run efficiently, get things out on time, and have basically like a well-oiled machine, whereas there should be others focused on the strategy, who are looking ahead as to where the organization is going and kind of steering the decision-making around the plan design and other types of incentives in the organization. Now, I do believe that the ops team should have a strong voice and certainly a seat at the table in making those decisions, because, may have stated earlier, a really amazing plan but poorly executed isn't going to be all that great at the end of the day. So there's definitely a balance between the two, but you need, in my opinion, you need one group very much focused on operational excellence and execution, and there are others who will be focused more on kind of forward-looking, where are we going, how do we change our incentive structures to guide us towards those kind of growth objectives. But I wouldn't put that burden on an operational team.
I do think comp admins should be involved within the design. I think they're closer to what can be tracked. They're closer to how it's being measured today. They're closer to what can or cannot be done with the data you have, and the accuracy of some of that data and how complex it is. You can design the best plan, but unless it's measurable, unless people trust the data that's going into it, then you end up demotivating salespeople with a plan that you cannot accurately measure and people do not truly trust. So I do think your comp admins have to be a part of it. They have access to the data, they understand it, and they can support from an analytical standpoint in terms of modeling different scenarios and making sure that whatever you design can truly be administered at the end of the day.
When it comes to sales compensation administration or the execution phase, this is what I'll define as, payroll to payroll. There's a person or a team of people that will go gather data and changes. They'll try to determine who gets paid for what, how much they get paid, and produce a set of reports. And like I said earlier, this is often viewed as a discrete and independent process of the design. When we ask this polling question of who owns the administration of the sales compensation plans, it fell into sales operations, finance, or HR. And the final question we asked was, are these the same department that owns the design and the execution? 60% of the company said it's not the same department. And so what we get is this, to me, some limitation, right? And I'll call it a failure to a degree, because to me, this is a connected, continuous process that should be owned by the same team in a single technology application, single database, that as you get results throughout the year, you're able to feed those back into your planning model, make adjustments or changes as needed, but you always have the latest and greatest data informing you on how your design is working, in addition to the kind of that baseline layer of how much should we pay folks. When people break it up, I don't think it's very effective. If you have to break it up for one reason or another at your organization, on the administration and execution side, I think it should fit within the department at your company that best represents the pay philosophy at your company. And what I mean by that is, how does your company view sales compensation? If your company views sales compensation as almost a necessary evil to do, you just want to get the right answer, you want to make sure that you have an accurate answer, a good audit trail, and that you're supporting regulatory compliance around commission expense accounting, well, it most likely in your organization would make sense to have that as part of finance. If you view sales compensation a little more progressively, the idea that you can motivate and drive sales rep behavior through sales compensation, if you utilize a lot of sales contests or spiffs to fill in the gaps from the design elements that you had for the planned year, then it would probably best suit your organization to have it in sales operations. They're the closest to sales and probably know what best motivates them, and there'll be that quick feedback loop of what's working and what's not working. If you're in a highly regulatory environment to where you must follow a set of rules or laws or face penalties, from government organizations, if your organization cares about the idea of equity and fairness within the plan, and you think about sales compensation as a recruitment and retention tool within your organization, then it would probably best fit within the HR organization to do the administration and execution of the plan. But I think from a best practice standpoint, the design team, whoever owns the design team, should also own sales compensation administration and execution.